All right, welcome back. Another episode of the Higher Ed Podcast. I'm your host, Kamar DJarnett, flying solo today. Got a great guest, Dr. Andy Binanti. I am so happy for you to join us today. And could you just kind of give our audience an introduction? You give us the origin story. Don't give us the novel, but you give us nice information about who you are and how you got to this point in your career.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I am currently a leader in higher education. I've been in the higher education setting for about 11 or 12 years. Really started in the private sector, which is very different than the public sector. I currently live in the public sector. And so on the private side, I started really through faculty member, externship coordinator, program director, and then ultimately dean. And I recently transitioned about a year ago into the public sector. And so, of course, this is all post-pandemic and really ties into the changing needs of students and what student retention looks like. And of course, there's really different visions and missions for private versus public. So I do feel well equipped to be able to speak on student retention.
Absolutely. Okay. And maybe a little bit about why that is one of your passions, the changing needs of student retention.
So I'll say I am a first generation college student.
Sure.
I think that plays a huge role. Uh, my doctorate was it's an EDD, and my dissertation was all on student retention. And really, what led me there is changing from one private institution where student retention was really just not part of the conversation because they had an amazing student retention to a different private institution where that was the primary conversation. And really, what I noticed was the first institution I served really accommodated well to the student needs. And of course, depending on the population of students you serve, you have to be tied into the community and what our students need. And so, certainly, I'm a student advocate, and I'm always trying to pivot and adapt to meet the needs of our patrons.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because normally the primary focus is getting students, and getting students. And retention tends to fall to the wayside. But I think being in the private sector, that probably takes on a whole nother life for you.
Certainly. Yeah, I think, when you think of the private sector, yes, student enrollment is a huge component. Uh, but it's not a standalone. Student
Yeah.
retention is just as important. And so I've always been on that academic side, not operations. So it's really a collaborative approach.
Absolutely. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up AI and artificial intelligence in regard to that's kind of the hot catchphrase or buzzword nowadays. Do you see that ever playing a part in the changing needs of student retention?
So you're right. AI is, it's the talk of the town, right, in higher education. It's also not going away. So as an institution, we need to teach our students how to use the resources that are available, and that includes AI. So I think as a leader in higher education, it's not something that we can be fearful of or try and combat. These AI software and platforms, they're popping up and developing much quicker than the tools that academic institutions or faculties have to really be able to identify them. So it's just making sure that we teach the students the right way to use them, and there is a right way and a place for these AI programs.
Now, when you say that there's changing needs, right? Are you saying that student retention is becoming more of an issue in terms of students dropping more often and even earlier through the program? Or are you more just kind of saying that in order to maintain students, we have to adjust to the needs of students in this day and time.
So I think when you think of the needs of students, I don't know how long ago you went to school, but students had nothing but options, right? And I think the options kind of have ebbed and flowed. There's been more and there's been less, but now post pandemic, what you see are the options that are available have withstood a global pandemic. And so by being able to withstand, students know that, there's something with this institution that's making it successful. So if I go to a higher education institution that's just not meeting my needs, because certainly they've changed post pandemic, then I can go somewhere that will.
Sure.
And I like to think of higher education institutions, in any business we talk about competitors. I don't feel neighboring higher education institutions are competing against one another. I think they offer a unique set of resources available to their students that it's making sure you find the right institution for the right student. There's plenty of students to go around to meet the needs of the institutions, but it's really about how you're going to support that student. And I may support a student very differently than what they need. So there's another institution that can adapt to that student.
How much of an impact do you think the pandemic actually had?
Was huge, right? And we even see it with higher education professionals, right? That we have now set a precedent that shows that brick and mortar institutions can operate completely online, right? That is something that a decade ago we would not have ever; those words would have never passed my lips. But now we recognize that is a true capability, and students recognize that too. So if students are being asked to come to class and they feel as though it could be online, or even depending on what that coursework looks like in the class, if that can be done elsewhere outside of class, uh, they recognize that post pandemic. So it is very different. I do think that the pandemic did isolate a large group of students too that need that in-person interaction, that more supportive environment. And so a higher education institution needs to be able to adapt to the needs. And so maybe that's offering online, hybrid, and in person because all the needs are so different. And if you're trying to diversify your student population, that's one approach.
Absolutely. When you think about the changing needs of student retention, does finance play a part into this at all?
Certainly it does. I think this goes back to my comment about students have options,
Yep.
right? And so cost, bottom line, is always going to play a role as a factor in selecting the right institution for you. There are institutions out there and even programs out there where you can't get financial aid. Well, some students that's just going to eliminate that as an option for them. Some may be, in tune or in a position where they can, depending on other factors within those programs. But certainly, finances is always going to play a role. And now that the federal government has changed the FAFSA process, that also is influencing student readiness on when to pursue an academic degree.
When you think about the top three things that higher education can do to support the changing needs in regard to student retention, how do you think about that? What do you think about?
I think it comes down to student resources, uh, faculty engagement, right? And I'll even throw in flexibility. Those are probably the two biggest. And then of course the programs offered, right? So the programs offered, we're trying to meet the needs of the community. That's students and employers alike. When we talk about the resources available, it is no longer enough to just present content to our students and expect them to absorb it or tell them to go look in a book. We need to provide resources that are going to allow them to be successful. That includes interactive um, interactive engagement in the classroom. That includes video resources. We're recognizing it. Not every student can just learn everything by listening. They need to see, they need to feel, they need to touch. So we need to provide them the resources that allow them to do so. Tutoring is another resource, right? Not all students are going to learn from uh, their teaching delivery style from that faculty member. What other resources do you have available to help support them throughout their journey? And I mentioned faculty engagement and flexibility. When I went to school 20 years ago, 10 years ago, uh, it was okay to say for a faculty member, here's the content. You're either going to get it, you're not. You're going to study or you're not. You're either going to pass or not. Uh, that's no longer the language that we should be using in higher education. We should now be, here's the content. Do you understand? How can I get you to understand to a higher level? What can I do to bring you to the next stage of learning? And it shouldn't just be you're going to pass or not. We should give them all the tools to be successful to pass.
What do you think about these certs that people are talking about? Like lessening the time that the students have to kind of spend, in programs and, moving or creating more of these 8-month, 9-month, 12-month certs. Does that play a part or in the changing needs in student retention?
We call that a pathway. And so these small credentials or shorter time to credential, it's important. It's important for the non-traditional student, even the traditional student, because it doesn't only enhance their academic portfolio, but it puts them into the workforce sooner. And uh, when we talk about, and we already talked about finances, right? How
Yep.
students are going to get through. Why wouldn't a higher education institution offer a credential at a shorter length, get those students in field, allow them to start working so they can pay to continue on to advance their degree, or even better, get them out into the field into an industry where there's some type of tuition incentive or reimbursements where their employer is then paying for that advanced degree. Uh,
Mm.
I couldn't see any other way. When I was a student, that's how I did. I worked the entire time. I had a medical assisting credential, and that's what got me through with tuition reimbursement to pay for school.
You bring up an excellent point. How important is the relationship with employers and colleges and institutions in regard to supporting the students' changing needs in order to help retain the students?
Well, the community and the employers, those are stakeholders to any institution,
Yep.
right? We refer to those as external stakeholders, and um, we're we serve them, right? In addition to serving the students, we serve them. And I say that because as our graduates are graduating, uh, we're no longer academic institutions where here's your degree. It's here's your degree and this is how you can apply it, what you can do with it. So higher education institutions have had to expand the resources and the portfolio that they're offering their students to meet those needs. Um, most and I really most of my time has been spent in allied health
Yep.
or career technical fields. And so really the employer needs and demands, that's what's driving the program enrollments and the programs that are offering within the institutions I've served. And so I say all that because we attempt in the career tech and allied health, we attempt to make sure industry standards are regularly met and gather feedback from our local employers. And we do this in a few ways. Many of these programs have some type of internship or externship, and we're gathering feedback from those site evaluators on what our students are doing, how they're performing, and any feedback they have about the program. We're also doing it with employer surveys after our graduates have graduated and they're getting jobs. We're maintaining those relationships with those local employers to hear, like, are there any gaps in our curriculum? And then most also offer a program advisory committee or advisory board where, again, key stakeholders, which includes externship evaluators, local employers, members of the higher education institution, to just reiterate what industry standards, where do we need to go with our program, how our students are doing. Uh, and I think that that's a really great balance to make sure that our students are marketable once they graduate the programs.
In terms of kind of your peers and staff, do you see that they understand the changing needs, or is it something that a lot of staff would experience and that have been in the industry are maybe struggling a little bit with some of these new kind of challenges?
So I'll answer that question in two parts. On the private side, I think my colleagues and peers would recognize that and agree. Those institutions are really driven and guided to meet the needs of the community and drive student enrollments, make sure we're retaining students, and provide applicable resources that they can use throughout their journey. I think on the public or state side, slower to change.
Mm.
So when we say here, post pandemic, the changing needs of students, they agree there are changing needs, but they're not necessarily as nimble to change. And there's just slow to change is probably the best word I can use.
Why do you think that is?
Great question. Um, I mean, for full transparency, I think a lot of state and public schools have a tenure process for faculty. Tenure process is great, very important, and signifies a lot for faculty. But I do think that it can um, negatively impact or even halt professional growth and development when it comes to adapting to things like we're talking about, the changing needs for students.
Got it. How do you see that playing out, I guess, big picture in higher ed? And the reason why I ask that is because, one of our kind of famous questions is where do you see higher ed, 5, 10 years from now, right? And, with artificial intelligence and just everything being at its peak, like we're experiencing change at a much faster rate than we have historically, right? And it's kind of one of those things that if you don't adapt sooner rather than later, it's really the impact of that lack of adaptation is really going to be felt. Does that make sense?
It does. I think when we talk about the future of higher ed, whether the public institutions are nimble enough to change or not, they're not going anywhere. They are the traditional brick and mortar. When we talk about higher education, college, university, at our dinner tables, we're talking about these state and public institutions, and they serve a large population of students. They offer lower tuition. Um, as a citizen, we're paying tax dollars towards these institutions, so they're always going to have a place. Uh, we think of college readiness or preparedness. Those that have gone up through the primary and secondary school, they're very in line with what their public or state schools are offering in the area. Uh, but that being said, private institutions, they're not going anywhere either because they are nimble enough to change. And if you haven't heard of them, they're going to remain around. They're going to keep advertising, marketing, and they're marketing all those things that the students that have these different needs, they hear, right? Those student resources. Why kick this school? When I sit at my kitchen table, with my family and I talk about the local community college or the state school, there's no why about it. We know those schools. The marketing for those private schools, they answer a lot of the whys, and that can entice students and lead students to the doorsteps of those institutions.
Yeah, then a private sector, I think the accreditation and guidelines and rules are much more stringent. Do you think that also plays a part in, I guess how astute the private institutions are when it comes to responding to the changing needs of students?
I I wouldn't say that the guidelines accreditation, um, I wouldn't say they're really that much different between private and state.
Okay.
I would say they're very in line. Now serving as a dean at both,
Okay.
follow the same regulations, same governing bodies, same regional accreditation. I think what plays a huge role are the public's lack of knowledge, right? Again, I'll go back to that example when I'm sitting at my kitchen table and I'm talking about the local community college or state school. Accreditation is not a question,
Mm,
right? Because we know their reputation. When it comes to these private schools, that's when it becomes a question. And again, not different. We just don't know the answer because we don't know the reputation. But they are very much so held to the same standards and guidelines of state schools. I would say probably the biggest difference that I would see between private and public are the grant dollars in addition to the tax dollars that are funneled towards those public institutions.
gotcha. Okay. All right. And I guess when you take, I guess that 10, 15 year kind of look or overview, do you see college itself ultimately just becoming shorter and that being a help for retaining more students? Or what do you see that as you look down the fairway, as they say?
Yes, I think what we're seeing is we're seeing more accelerated programs. And so
Mm,
by accelerated, what we refer to as accelerated is not necessarily, more content, same content in a shorter period of time, which is just getting them on the track to finish and be successful faster. I do see a little bit more of that in the future. I also see more options, right? We see competency based education. That's really on the rise. That's where students can kind of go at their own pace. If they feel they can get done with a 2 year degree in a year, then go ahead, get it done. Um, I think institutions need to take into account other experience and other uh, credits for transfer, because I think that also plays into time to completion. That really becomes important in higher education. My dissertation, when I was focused on retention, I was really intentionally focused on the length of program. So
mm,
I looked at students that are enrolled in a diploma program and students that are enrolled in an associate's program. Oftentimes, there's at least a course that overlaps. And I explored what the student retention looked like in that course where there was overlap. Did students that were in the diploma program have a lower retention than those ultimately uh, were taking it towards an associate's? Uh, I was really surprised, and maybe I had a little bias when I was doing my research, but I was really surprised there was no statistical difference or significance between the two. And based on diploma or associate degree, the retention was about the same.
mm.
Now, that's not to generalize for any institution, but the institution I explored, that was the case.
Got it. Okay. All right. is there any LinkedIn, Facebook, social media where our audience can get in touch with you?
Certainly, I can be found on LinkedIn, uh, Andy Binanti. I think I pop right up. There's not many Andy Binantis.
Uh-huh. Anything else?
No, I think LinkedIn is good. I mean, certainly you can find me with whatever organization I'm ultimately serving. I do try to stay active in higher education. So right now, in addition to my role as a leader in a public institution, I also teach at a public institution in person. I teach online for a private institution. I do dissertation reviews for doctoral students again in the private sector. So I could probably talk about student retention all day. So yeah, feel free to reach out through LinkedIn.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I'll let you go. I appreciate you spending some time with us today. You were awesome. This was very engaging. Appreciate your insight and enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Appreciate it.